First up is Robert Eggers' take on Nosferatu, and Nosferatu is one of those interesting ones. So I talk about this constantly. I don't like scary movies. I get very easily scared by them, and so they stick in my brain. But for whatever reason, I think maybe because pop culture-wise, I'm so familiar with the story of Dracula and Nosferatu, etc., that like I can handle it because I know the structure of it, right? And I will say that as far as Nosferatu tellings go, this is a very straightforward one. Now, Robert Eggers is one of those directors who, much like some of the other folks I've talked about in recent weeks, I don't like worship at the altar of him. I haven't seen The Witch because it looked too scary for me. I am not a fan of The Lighthouse in any way, shape, or form. I couldn't do it. Did not jive with me. I did, however, really like The Northman. So going into Nosferatu, I was like, we're going to see how this goes. I think it's a very strong, solid telling of the story of Dracula. I think this is definitely a good marriage of Robert Eggers, I guess, like area of interest and genre, etc., and a story that we all know. Now, do I need to see Nosferatu again? Probably not. I mean, we've seen it so many times of late. I think this is a really, again, solid telling of it. I think for some people, this will actually become the modern, definitive version of it because it encompasses a lot of the parts of Nosferatu. I think it makes a lot of nods to things that are sometimes overlooked, especially in screen adaptations. Like we get the Last Voyage of the Demeter part of this. Although what we don't need is the entire film, The Last Voyage of the Demeter. So like I said, we've seen this story, this character on screen so many times. But yes, so Bill Skarsgård plays Count Orlok. Nicholas Hoult, I think, is superb in this. He plays Thomas Hutter, who is the barrister, lawyer, whatever you want to call him, who crosses paths with Nosferatu. Lily Rose Depp plays Ellen Hutter, and she is a character who is connected to him from early on. And I think the thing about like Nosferatu that I don't always love, but I get that it is the story, is like the relationship that the character has with like young women. And she's an adult, but it's still like, it's predatory because he's a predator, and I don't love it, and I don't always love the way that Robert Eggers portrays women in his films, / I don't particularly love it. I think this is one of the more tame versions of it, and it's, fitting for, I don't think he was necessarily told, like, make this available to a wide audience, but I feel like maybe he was like, I will consider compromising in some places and not going as extreme here and going in other directions. So anyway, Lily Rose Depp is Aaron Taylor Johnson and Emma Corrin play the Hardings, who are friends of the Hutters, and they are characters who I don't think we always get as extensively in Nosferatu and Dracula tellings. Ralph Ineson is in this, classic collaborator with Robert Eggers, and then the highlight of this film for me is Willem Dafoe. And, I think it's a considerable amount of time before Willem Dafoe came on screen, and then it becomes a whole different movie, and I was like, this half of the movie is the half of the movie that I am here for. No questions asked. The first half, I was like, okay, freaky, do your thing, etc. So if you are a hardcore fan of the story of Nosferatu, Robert Eggers agnostic, but love Nosferatu, I think you're going to really like this film in terms of modern versions of it. I was trying to think of maybe a recent version that is taking the, kind of direct interpretation of it that holds up to this. And I think I couldn't think of like exactly one, I think sometimes they're more campy. Sometimes they're doing their completely own thing. There's a version with Claes Bang, I'm totally mispronouncing his name, who was actually in Robert Eggers' The Northman that I think is like a mini series that I thought was pretty decent recently. But I think this, for a lot of folks, is going to become it, because if you look at this versus something like a Francis Ford Coppola's, Bram Stoker's Dracula, that has become a little more campy and classic in some senses. And so I think this is a more serious, direct version of it. And so for those folks, it will definitely scratch the itch. If you are a hardcore Robert Eggers fan, great news for you. You're going to have a wonderful time at this. If you are someone who is maybe on the fence about this, I actually think there's a lot of craftsmanship in this. I think if you are like me and you are a little squeamish, the squeamish part, not the scared part, the squeamish part, you may need to wait till this comes out, on digital so you can watch it at home with the lights on. It's not as scary as I thought it was going to be, but I think I was maybe trying to like prepare myself. But, there are suspenseful moments. There are some visually unsettling things that I think they've been very intentionally like keeping out of trailers and stuff so far, which I'm glad they've done. But yeah, so if you are inclined to see this film, I'm going to say yes, you're going to have a good time. If you are not, just because of the subject matter or the director or whatever it is, like, I think if you haven't before, this is not going to be the one that makes you a convert, and I respect that, and I get it, but this is a very much like trying to be by the book telling of it with Robert Eggers' stylings on it, but there's clearly an admiration for the source material. So I'm going to give this a 3.9 out of 5. The next film I have this week is called Babygirl, and it is from director Halina Regeane, who did Bodies, 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 which I hadn't seen for a really long time, and I really actually wish I had, because I thought it was going to be much scarier than it is, and like I said with Nosferatu, like, I don't like scary movies. It's actually super clever. I should also say, so my family, our tradition on Christmas is to go see a movie and get Chinese food, and this year the pickings were weird. We don't really do it anymore post-pandemic, but I'm glad that I didn't have to choose any of these things, because I do worry that my parents would have been like, we should go see Babygirl because it has Nicole Kidman in it and we know who she is. And I would have had to be like, I don't want to sit next to you during this. That's just not the relationship we have. So, Babygirl is a film. It's about power. Nicole Kidman plays a high-powered CEO, and Harris Dickinson is a young, entry-level intern who starts at her company, and then they begin an affair. And this is a sexually charged film without any questions. It kind of gave Secretary vibes, if you've seen that film, with Maggie Gyllenhaal and James Spader, like way back when. It's also, I don't want to call it like The Graduate-esque, but it's definitely about the dynamics of relationships and sexuality and power, and it's interesting having a woman in the position of power. Now, one of the things that's just like a little challenging casting-wise is Nicole Kidman's husband is played by Antonio Banderas, and you're just like, oh, that's a bummer that, like, a guy that, and a lot of people consider a sex symbol, is not fulfilling enough for this character, romantically. But at the same time, you're like, well, yeah, like, you got to be able to please women. Just because you're good looking doesn't mean you're, like, the perfect sexual partner. So, anyway, I think Harris Dickinson in this is... there's going to be a lot of new fans of his. I mean, not to say that there aren't fans of Nicole Kidman, but I don't know if as many people are familiar with Harris Dickinson. I remember seeing him in one of his first on-screen roles in Beach Rats. He has this really great emotional range, and in this, he does a really good job of playing that within, like, a controlled sphere. And in terms of, like, power dynamics in a relationship, you're like, oh, that's hot. He also is in Triangle of Sadness, which if you have not seen, please go see because it's spectacular. He's in The Iron Claw. If he wasn't a name on your radar before, like, please put him on your radar. Nicole Kidman, I think she's great in this role. I'm not the biggest Nicole Kidman fan. I'm not a fan, but I'm not someone who's like, oh my God, Nicole Kidman's in a new movie. I must go see this. And like I said, you have Antonio Banderas, you have Sophia Wilde, you have Esther McGregor, and you have Vaughn Riley. And yeah, so I also have to caveat, I saw this film at TIFF, and I saw it very late, and it was one of the last films I saw, and so I'm not gonna lie, and this is no disrespect to the film, this is just, I've said this for every movie I've seen at TIFF, like, it was just an intense experience, and so seeing it with a crowd, I do actually, if you can tolerate the, like, kind of discomfort and, like, are comfortable enough with yourself and you're willing to see it with a theater full of people, like, the shared experience of people just being, like, shocked, but not necessarily in a judgmental way, but just being like, oh, this is happening now, was riveting. There was a point, and I'm so sorry to this film, and I hate to admit it, but I'm gonna say it, I fell asleep for a little bit, and I didn't miss anything technically plot-wise, but the one scene I fell asleep in, and I went back and I saw the film, not exhausted, and I saw it again. I was like, oh, this still holds up. But I was like, I don't know how I fell asleep during this. Just volume-wise. There's a very loud scene. I was like, how did that happen? So anyway, this film definitely stuck with me. I think it's really well done performances. I think it's definitely an exploration of modern sexuality and especially gender dynamics that is going to challenge a lot of people. And I think some people will feel uncomfortable with it. And I think it's okay to feel uncomfortable as long as you're not being super judgmental about it. I think it definitely is a great conversation opener about, female characters in power, and also that, like, women don't have to be paragons just because they're women and they shouldn't be held I mean, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, cool, anybody can be a bad person in some senses by our current societal norms of it. So Babygirl definitely stuck with me since. If you are like me and you do see movies with your entire family during Christmas, just take that into consideration. And, whatever your relationship with your family is your relationship with your family. But, it is definitely a sexually charged film. So be aware of that. But I do think the performances and the story itself are absolutely worth seeing. I'm going to give this a 4.2 out of 5. The last film I have this week is called A Complete Unknown, and this is a Bob Dylan biopic. It's from director James Mangold, who also did Walk the Line, the Johnny Cash biopic. He also did Ford v Ferrari, and one of my favorite films, Logan. So he definitely has a thing for this kind of era of music and these, types of musicians. And so this one stars Timothée Chalamet as Bob Dylan. And from a visual perspective, I'm like, okay, I guess they have like a similar jawline and hair when they were young and all of that stuff. That's about, I think, where it ends. And I say this as someone who actually thinks Timothée Chalamet is a good actor. I'm not saying he's a bad actor. I just don't see him as Bob Dylan. And I went into it open-minded. Or actually, I could maybe sort of see him as Bob Dylan for like a minute. But then his presence as Bob Dylan doesn't do it for me. And maybe I don't know enough about young Dylan, but this film definitely did not make me feel like I wanted to know more about young Dylan. And in fact, I don't know how Bob Dylan feels about this movie, but it feels like it takes away any of the mystique of, the legend that has become Bob Dylan. And maybe, actual Bob Dylan was like, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want because he doesn't care, which good for him. He's enlightened. But I was just like, oh, I think like the cultural thing that we've built Bob Dylan into is so different from this. And that's not to say that you have to be the version, you can grow into that story. Like the story can explore making him into that, but it doesn't do it in a very good, like I didn't find it very relatable or interesting even because it doesn't have to be relatable, right? It just has to be interesting and compelling. So Timothée Chalamet is Bob Dylan. Edward Norton is Pete Seeger, who I didn't realize or forgot wrote, some really classic songs that at the time were interpreted as rebellious effectively. This Land Is Your Land is not a protest song, but it is a protest song. It's like a very patriotic sounding song. You've got Elle Fanning as Sylvie Russo, who was in a relationship with young Bob Dylan. You've got Monica Barbaro as young Joan Baez. You've got Boyd Holbrook, who... not a fan. I know James Mangold loves him. As Johnny Cash. Scoot McNairy as Woody Guthrie. Dan Fogler as Albert Grossman, who's one of the agents. And then, it's just... So you've got all these very famous titans of music, right? And I think the thing with a biopic about a musician is maybe we don't always know exactly what a young version or even an older version of a character looks like, right? But we know what they sound like. And when this movie... it definitely uses music, and it uses a lot of music, and it uses a lot of music that's really well known. And the second that Timothée Chalamet started singing some of those Bob Dylan songs, I went, oh no, this is bad, this is upsetting, and this is bad. And there are some that he can maybe get away with a little bit more, but, there's a graveliness to Bob Dylan's voice, even younger Bob Dylan's voice, that is missing from this, and it just makes this feel super hollow and just, like, takes away any connection I had to it. And it's because, it's a victim of the success of actual Bob Dylan's recordings, but this is also about Bob Dylan hitting his peak popularity, right? So it's just like, it was a choice to have them say. I think the Joan Baez songs sound fine. The Pete Seeger songs sound fine. The Johnny Cash songs sound fine. It's just a lot of the Bob Dylan ones. And I'm just like, well, then don't cast someone who can't sing or don't have him sing, but you can't. It's one of the most distinct voices in, I think, modern music. And so it really took me out of it in a way that I was like, oh, I don't love this. And then by the end of the film, I was like, what is the point of this film? Because it feels like it cheapens the legend of Bob Dylan. And that's not to say that Bob Dylan doesn't deserve to be, like knocked down a peg, but it also doesn't do it in a way that feels like productive or like you're telling me anything new. I'm just like, okay, so he kind of ambled along and maybe sucked sometimes. Like, I don't know if I needed to know that info. Like, you're not coming at this in a pointed way, and you're not coming at this in like let's, revere him way. So then what is your perspective here? Because if I want to just read up or know about this era of Bob Dylan, I'll just do that. So I was disappointed by this film. I didn't even go in with high expectations, but I was just like, in fact, I went in expecting really not to like it. And unfortunately, I didn't hate it, but I wasn't like, yes, this captured me. And then, because again, my family does watch movies together on the holidays, this was one that I thought, okay, my parents, my dad especially, will be interested in this, but I didn't think he would like it, and I wasn't wrong. And that, to me, is always an indicator of this has not found its audience, because if my dad, who grew up in the era of listening to these folks and does love this music and, like, would be probably more generous to a film about just, like, a hetero white man, et cetera, who was, like, a legend of the time, and if he's not even like, oh, this was fine, not even fine, didn't even get a fine out of him, then I'm like, this did not succeed at what it set out to do. And because I don't even think it knew what it set out to do. So again, I don't think any of the actors are doing a bad job. I just don't think they were set up for success. And I don't think we should have had Timothée Chalamet sing Bob Dylan songs. It's just he can't do the Bob Dylan voice. Like, I think they should have maybe dubbed him or done whatever. I have to double check, but whatever voice they chose, if it wasn't Timothy, like, didn't work out. So this one, not really. I don't know who it's for. If it's not for folks like me, and it's not for folks like my dad, who's this for? Except for, like, Timothée Chalamet huge fans, which, okay, go ahead, have fun, like, enjoy yourself. I'm not going to say don't do it, but I'm going to say I think there are plenty of other better performances out of him and everybody else that you could go see. I'm going to give this a 2.5 out of 5.